Welcome, friends, to another episode of the Lifestyle Empowerment Podcast. So I figured I'd get into doing some more solo podcasts again. I really enjoy having my guests on. I get a lot of good feedback from them as well, but I am an educator. Not that these individuals are not educating people. I have had some that have been loads of information, sometimes too much maybe for some people. You know, I love that though. But I figured I will make some solo ones as well to help bring a total educational platform. Whereas the guests, you're more kind of like learning about their life and their experience and where they had come from and some like relatability and whatnot. But moving forward, I'm going to try to put out a little more. Been busy. So content creation is slightly put on the back burner, but still trying to make a priority to provide the best education for you guys. So in today's episode, I wanted to talk about psychedelics. So I'm titling this podcast, My Beef with Psychedelics. And the reason being is because it is becoming widely known the benefits of psychedelics. I'm going to start off by saying, although the title says My Beef with Psychedelics, I'm a big advocate of them, but I'm going to go a little more in depth from my perspective, my profession, and my experiences in terms of psychedelics. And I'm talking my experience with myself, as well as my experience with others, clients, friends, family, whichever. So I've actually been wanting to make this episode. If you look at my podcast ideas list, My Beef with Psychedelics was like number one. I started the podcast back in November. It was one of the first things that I wanted to do because I saw it really up and coming, but I feel people are using these under the incorrect context or not fully understanding the mechanisms and being biased by the very beneficial acute outcomes. So when it comes to this as well, I've seen lately, like Andrew Huberman, because I plan on doing one on ADD and ADHD. So I've seen Andrew Huberman come out with one on psychedelics. And Andrew Huberman is an absolutely brilliant man, much, much smarter than I am. But the difference being is he is coming from a different realm, a different perspective, rather than, where I come from. I start from the guts. And this is where I explain things is all kind of leading back to the guts. And that's just not his specialty. It's not what he chose to specialize in. It's not that he doesn't have that education or wouldn't know that education. It's just not where he prioritizes his time and his knowledge. And so this is where, for someone myself, being, the little guy, seeing it from a different perspective, I thought I would come on here and educate people because I have had a lot of experience with it, both myself and clients, and I have witnessed tremendous benefits. I've also witnessed really bad things. And so I'm going to go into explaining as to why these things occur, but I don't want people to be deterred from something that could potentially save their life. So I want to start off with like the benefits or kind of like what the mechanisms are and how it affects your body. And then I'll kind of go into is why you should be careful when using them and under what context you should use them in. Once again, too, so when we're talking psychedelics, I'm going to stay in the realm of most people are using psilocybin, so mushrooms. People are using acid, LSD. There is also ketamine, MDMA, but we're going to stay more in the realm of things like LSD and psilocybin. And I'll explain a little bit as I go on. So when it comes to microdosing, what the research shows is how it significantly helps with things like depression. And that is because if you look at the molecules of psilocybin, of LSD, they are relatively close to serotonin. Now, I have spoke about dopamine. I did a dopamine series and how dopamine is actually more correlated with depression than serotonin. So you go, okay, Curtis, if that's the case, then why are these psychedelics helping with depression? The reason being is how I explain serotonin to people is it is your alternator on your car. So those who are unfamiliar with an alternator, that is a piece of equipment on the vehicle that recharges your battery. So this is where serotonin comes in. This is why it's highest in your sleep, because it's recharging your batteries overnight. But dopamine and serotonin work inverse of each other. So I'll elaborate that a little more when I get into some of the other mechanisms. But serotonin will be recharging things like dopamine, improving your mood. Now, with that being said, acutely bouts of serotonin, depending on the individual, are also very beneficial for mood. But dopamine is more the driver when it comes to depression or the lack thereof, or, having ultimately suicidal thoughts and whatnot. Because if you look at people who win a big prize, they are significantly more happier than when they are sleeping. I know that sounds kind of dumb, but that's how I compare it, because serotonin is highest when you sleep. Because the higher your serotonin is, the lower your dopamine can potentially be, which we'll get into after this. So when we're looking at psychedelics, whether it is a bolus dose of psychedelics, so going on a trip, or it is microdosing psychedelics, how these things work, and we'll talk a little bit about neurons, and I've mentioned this in the past. Think of it as a subway rail. You go to subway station and you have to get to your destination. And so we're looking at neurons as like subway tunnels. This is the track. So we'll say the stomach is one station, the GI tract, where a good portion of serotonin is made, and the brain is the other station. It's your destination. So this serotonin has to travel from the gut through the subway, through the tunnels, and get to its destination, the next station, which is the brain. So how this works is you have your pre-neuron and you have your post-neuron. So your pre-neuron is the one that's going to, like the stomach will create the serotonin molecule, for example, and then send it down these neurons. And the pre-neuron is going to go push that molecule into what is called the synaptic cleft. So your neurons don't actually touch. There is a gap between them, and that is known as the synaptic cleft. So without getting too technical, I always explain there are three major fates that a molecule experiences within this synaptic cleft, whether it's serotonin, whether it's dopamine, acetylcholine, GABA, whichever. In this context, we're going to talk serotonin. So it'll go into the synaptic cleft, where either A, it gets uptaked by the postneuron, so it's making its way through the subway tunnels, or it gets broken down by an enzyme known as monoaminoxidase, MAO, or it gets reuptaked into the pre-neuron. So this is where the mechanism of antidepressants comes from, SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So it inhibits that serotonin molecule from being reuptaked into that pre-neuron. So simplified, it's increasing your chances of that serotonin molecule making its way to the subway station through the tunnels. But what happens is your body is, I was having a conversation the other day with somebody, and like I always say, we're miraculous meat suits, but the mechanisms that our bodies use are sometimes genius and sometimes seem dumb, but it's there for a purpose, mainly to protect you. So when we experience health issues, it's actually our body trying to protect us. We're survival machines, right? So what happens though is your brain smart. It recognizes that, okay, like this is actually an abundance of serotonin that doesn't make sense. It doesn't correlate with what is occurring within the physiology. So how your brain responds, other than mechanisms of like decreasing methylation and detoxification, so on and so forth, that medications bring on, is it increases the enzyme MAO that breaks down serotonin, and it downregulates the receptors in the brain. Now, this isn't always instantaneous. As mentioned in my dopamine video, the receptors go on like a weekly basis, right? They're going to slowly degrade, where the actual half-life of these molecules are going to be much shorter, but the receptors themselves are a weekly basis. So it's not like you're going to take one dosage of SSRIs or psilocybin and downregulate these receptors. It's over a short period of time. This is why proper guidance is so important. But anyways, so what happens now is with that downregulation in context of SSRIs and that upregulation of MAO, this is why individuals who come off of SSRIs are like super suicidal if done incorrectly. And they just feel awful, and then they go back on them because they can't seem to get off of them. But this is also why when individuals are on these medications, that they're kind of just numb. They're not promoting more dopamine, and they're not really promoting more or less serotonin. So they're kind of like in this gray area where they're just numb and they don't really notice benefits, but they don't feel as awful anymore. So they kind of stick with this lifestyle. It's better to feel numb than depressed is how we look at it. But then now we're looking at, damaged mucosal lining, poor methylation, lack of sex drive, all these other issues that can come along with this. So when we look at things like psilocybin, a microdose is kind of the same aspect. Now, remember, I'm keeping things super simplified. Like if you go listen to Andrew Huberman, he's going to have a super complex way of speaking on this, but I'm going to keep it super simplified for relatability and to not go over people's heads, to actually keep engagement. So super simplified, the microdosing aspect is going to create the same effects as something like SSRIs. But the difference between the SSRI is only blocking the reuptake, where you are adding more serotonin by taking a micro dose of psilocybin or even a bolus dose of LSD and acid and such. So it's adding more serotonin. So this is where we feel those great benefits. You can be in this horrendous mood and you can do a micro dose or even a heavy dose and, you know, you're going to have a good time, right? Or you're going to, if you do a proper micro dose, you're going to feel great. You know, you're going to be more creative. You're going to have more energy. All these aspects are going to affect a lot of your physiology, improving your mood and your overall well-being. So you're like, awesome, that's amazing. Why wouldn't we all do this? Well, the reason being we don't want to all do this is because everybody responds differently, but it's also the long-term effects. But as mentioned, I want to focus a little more on the benefits of this. So when you have individuals who have suffered from like PTSD or extreme amounts of trauma, that trauma is creating neurotoxicity, it's creating gut dysfunction, especially if it's like unaddressed underlying trauma. So you're not getting a lot of serotonin. So you're adding serotonin to your body. You are taking a supplemental source of serotonin, which is going to really, you know, reap the benefits of having adequate levels of serotonin within the brain. Now remember, just because you create serotonin doesn't always mean that your subway train is going to get there. So that's important to understand too. There's the difference between like actual uptake within the brain, but I'm not going to get in. That's a different subject. But you're simply adding more serotonin by microdosing these psychedelics. But as mentioned, your body knows I'm not making a lot of serotonin. So where is all of this serotonin coming from? And that's where it begins to respond by downregulating receptors. Because if it didn't downregulate receptors or increase MAO, you would just be, excuse my language, but tripping balls all the time, right? And the brain doesn't want that. It's not a healthy thing to be doing that. It could be fun, but it's not a healthy thing to be doing that. So the brain is going to respond by downregulating receptors and increasing the enzyme to break it down. So this is why, as you continue on, like anything, you need to take more and more to get the same effects. And then you just don't really. This is why you'll hear these guys that, you know, you pick up your LSD or you pick up your psilocybin, your mushrooms. They'll say, yeah, just go on a trip, but then you have to wait X amount of time before you go on another trip. That's because the receptors have been downregulated. Or you might hear of things like the MDMA blues. That's because of the response of the MAO, monoamine, and the receptors being downregulated. So that is why I'm not a huge advocate of psychedelics, especially under the wrong context and without proper supervision. Because how I explain this to people is, let's say we are talking depression. Your depression is not from the fact that you are not taking psychedelics. So when you take a psychedelic, you're masking the issue. So this is what I find really ironic about our societies is a lot of us demonize doctors and Western medication when psilocybin is the same thing. You are masking a symptom. You are putting a Band-Aid on an open wound. So yes, you're going to feel better acutely. And I'll jump to this. Another thing where psilocybin, or we'll just say psychedelics in general, really help, especially going on a trip. So if you do like enough and you go into a different realm, or however people want to explain these things, entities, whether that's DMT, ayahuasca is the same thing as DMT. It just contains monoamine inhibitors, MAO inhibitors. So you can actually get the benefits because DMT is out of your system relatively fast because you break it down so fast. But I explain it as they help you check your ego. So if you're somebody who is like really, you know, throwing around labels is kind of frustrating and annoying, but let's say victim mentality or something like that, or you know, you think your life is bad or whichever. Psychedelics can help you see the brighter side of things. It can check your ego when you go on like the big trips. Then you come out of that trip, there's probably a more scientific term for this, but we'll call it trip. Most people can relate to that. When you come out of this trip, you have this newfound appreciation for life. You realize that, okay, maybe my problems weren't so bad. And now I have the motivation because I understand that my problems are not so bad, that I can actually begin to work on them rather than, you know, wallow in my self-pity. I'm not saying that's what people are doing, but that's just kind of the way I'm trying to explain it. So this is where psychedelics can really help individuals have a new perspective on life, a whole new outlook. And that in return is what can really help them heal. But if you are somebody who has an extremely damaged mucosal lining, if you are riddled with toxins, if you have overgrowth of bacteria, if you have low levels of stomach acid, if you have high levels of mycotoxins, psilocybin is fungus, it's mushrooms, you're going to exacerbate those symptoms. So you're going to acutely feel better. So this is what I see all the time. I see it all the time. And it's kind of like I treat it as a joke, but it's a very serious thing. You'll see someone on Instagram and they'll have on their Instagram story, or they'll post it to their actual page, talking about the benefits of psychedelics, of microdosing psychedelics. And you'll see #heal or whatever they like to use. Then 6 months go by, and all of a sudden you don't see these posts anymore. You don't see them talking about psychedelics anymore. You don't see them ranting and raving. You actually don't hear a lot from them. That's because they downregulated their receptors and upregulated MAO. So now they're back at square one because they weren't addressing what was actually creating the low serotonin in the first place. Now, as mentioned, going on a big enough trip can really reduce that stress because it changes your perspective on life. We'll just say, for simplicity's sake, it makes you more positive. So now you're producing less cortisol. So if there wasn't like an extreme underlying condition, because like once you've had an immense bout of stress and you've damaged that mucosal lining and you've potentially created an overgrowth of bacteria, H. pylori, candida, SIBO, whichever, removing stress doesn't cause the symptoms to get worse, but in most cases, it doesn't get rid of them. They're still there. That underlying root cause is still there. And then you're just masking it by microdosing these substances. So we need to take care of the underlying root cause first. So now if you're that individual, like I'm gonna jump ahead here, and let's say you take care of your guts and everything's well, psychedelics are an amazing tool for being more creative, for, thinking outside of the box. Once again, changing your perspective, even if it's just a micro dose. So that is where a lot of people, where they're fine, they're not depressed, they're totally okay, but they will take psychedelics to be more creative. There's a lot of people that are unfamiliar with, a lot of successful people do psychedelics. It's because it's what gives them that edge. They're not masking symptoms. They're just trying to be better. So it's like a performance enhancer we could look at. So this is where they talk about, you look at artists who write, do, or draw, or paint, or whatever crazy things. You say, oh, that guy must have been on drugs. Probably were. Or at one point they probably were, which gave them that creativity, which ultimately can lead to high dopamine, then schizophrenia. Because if you look at people who have schizophrenia, they do some pretty crazy ass drawings. That's because their dopamine is so high, because that's what schizophrenia is, just too much dopamine in the brain. So you see these awesome pictures coming from it, but this is what psychedelics can lead to. Now, obviously that's the extreme end and we don't want to go there, but that is what happens from these individuals who use psychedelics. Plus, there is a ton of evidence. You can't argue this. Like the Greeks, for example, they're finding traces, like tons of traces of psychedelics. I can't remember the exact terminology for it, but it was like DMT in there. I can't remember the name, but anyways, they're finding it in these vases, these wine vases and everything. And so they believe that's what stimulated them to come up with like democracy. And I'm not very good with politics and history and all that kind of stuff, just have a general idea. But that's where all these crazy Greek mythology comes from as well. But more interesting, I find, is research is starting to show that because our brains doubled in size in such a rapid time, like it was thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, but on the scale of 14 billion years, it's really freaking quick. They are contributing that to the use of psychedelics. Now, there's some funny memes, like the first people to discover psychedelics. Oh, this one kills you. This one makes you see floating bunny rabbits, whatever, right? It's probably what did happen. But they are thinking they're contributing that evolutionary aspect of the enlarged brain compared to previous ancestors to psychedelics. Now, I'm not saying that's what it is. I'm just saying this is what research is saying. But I don't think it's a far-fetched idea to say that potentially psychedelics have caused this growth in our brain. But because societal aspects, we have demonized psychedelics because human beings love to abuse things. They love to abuse things. It's what I say about like performance enhancing drugs, steroids, for example. They were founded to actually help save lives. Like Anavar was for cancer patients so their muscle wouldn't waste away. But human beings, this helps with muscle wasting, but it also helps build muscle. So let's jack it up and let's look amazing, right? So same thing with psychedelics. Oh, this makes me feel really good. Plus, I love seeing pink elephants. So let's take a bunch of this. But then we end up, once again, downregulating receptors, increasing MAO. They claim brain damage. We got weirdos. They go schizophrenic. So now psychedelics are very, very bad. That's because they were abused, we'll put in quotations, used improperly under the wrong context or just used improperly. Maybe the context is right. It was just used improperly. So this is where where psychedelics get a bad name. People like to party. So partying is bad for you. You're wasting your life, which yes, 100% agree. So that's why these things have a bad name, just like steroids, because people have died from them due to the abuse of wanting to be 300 pounds of pure muscle. So psychedelics, though, have shown, the research is showing tons of benefits, especially with PTSD. But I think, if I recall correctly, the research is bolus doses, not microdosing. We're talking bolus doses of psilocybin or LSD. And that is what's helping people with the PTSD because of creating that new perspective. Like if you talk to anybody who has done DMT, they all will say the same thing. They saw some sort of entity, whether it was a really fat cat, whether it was a chicken, whatever it may be, it is some sort of entity that checks you. I call it checks yourself, right? You gotta check yourself before you wreck yourself. That's what this entity does. And so that's where these psychedelics are creating this health benefits, because that new perspective means less cortisol, which means better guts, which means better thyroid, which means better cognitive performance, which means better mood, better physique. So this is where it's coming from. But as mentioned, we are in a society now where so many of us are, I'm just going to say, damaged. We have immense gut issues. We have cognitive issues. We have toxicity issues, poor sleep, screens, poor relationships, you name it. So there's these drastic health conditions now that going on a single trip will help, but it's not the answer. It's not the end all be all. It's an addition. It's a supplement, but it's not like, oh, you have SIBO, or you have rheumatoid arthritis, you have an autoimmune disease, or you're miserable, you're depressed, so you should do a bolus dose. I'm not saying don't. I'm just saying that's not what's going to fix that. And that's where my beef with psychedelics comes from, is because we think they're the end all be all. Yeah, they're amazing. I'm not saying they're not, but they have side effects just like anything else. And what I really see with long-term microdosing, because of the reduction of serotonin, which means the reduction of dopamine, which means the reduction of thyroid, which means the increase in cortisol, you see a lot of adrenaline issues. So myself, for example, if I take too much of a microdose, not going into the trip realm, I will get anxiety. So that anxiety means overproduction of cortisol, which means an overproduction of adrenaline, which means it's feeding the pathogens in my gut and damaging my mucosal lining. So I might feel good in the moment until they take over too much. And then the next day you feel like crap. You might be sad, lack of creativity, whatever it means, or whatever it does to you. So this is where it's understanding that psychedelics are not going to fix your intense health issues, but they can greatly benefit. So let's say you have an overgrowth of bacteria. So what we have to do, if you have an overgrowth of bacteria, so bad bugs within your gut, we need to go in there and we need to kill them. We need to destroy them and get rid of them. But that killing aspect is going to create more symptoms, but it's part of the process. But it is potentially going to damage that mucosal lining even further, especially if you're not doing things properly. So what happens now is these people, their mood just tanks. They have very poor mood. They become irritable. They become angry. They become sad. They become depressed. They can't sleep properly. And then that just makes things worse, because now they're putting out even more cortisol. So you're not winning the battle, because that cortisol and adrenaline are feeding the bacteria even more, those ones that you're trying to kill off. And it's destroying the gut lining even more, the lining that you're trying to repair while doing this. So this is where I've had the conversation with some people where I'm like, hey, this might be a good place for psychedelics, because you're going to bypass that, but you're using them under the proper supervision and under the right context. So now you're not going to abuse them. You're not going to overdo it. We're going to do things to restore neurotransmitter receptors. We're not going to be increasing too much MAO, because we can use natural MAO inhibitors like kava kava, for example, things along those nature. But now you're going to be in a better mood. You're going to be sleeping better. You're not going to be in this downward spiral of emotions because your guts are being torn apart. So that's going to lessen your cortisol. It's going to improve your thyroid. It's going to take away from feeding these bad bugs and take away from destroying that gut lining. It's going to help us expedite this gut protocol. It's really amazing, actually. It works really, really well for individuals. And that's how they get through this, because if you don't treat that aspect, in no way, shape, or form, I'm saying that anyone doing a gut health protocol, like a killing protocol that experiences these negative emotions needs to do psychedelics, I would never, force someone to do psychedelics. I will educate them properly and assure their safety. But this can help you actually get through it, because where most people are experiencing these feelings, they quit, they give up because they stop killing. It takes away these symptoms, but that damage is still there and it's not being repaired. But they wanted to give up because they just couldn't handle it. And I get that. I've been there myself. My coach and mentor can attest to that. I would blow up his phone. It was just miserable, And I have clients too. They'll probably put their hand up if they're listening to this and be like, yeah, that's me. Right. And so once again, though, you don't have to do psychedelics, but they can help. But there is always, you have to be worried about, I don't really want to use the word addiction, but to make sense of the conversation and imply what I'm trying to say is there's that addiction aspect. Because if you feel like absolute garbage and then you take psilocybin or you take LSD and all of a sudden you feel great and you actually have the motivation to stick to this program and go work out because it's what you want to do and clean your house and write that essay or whatever it is you're doing, well, you're going to continuously want that feeling. You're not going to want to go back to feeling like garbage. And so this is where you have to be very, very careful about using psychedelics. The same with I'll tell people nicotine gum. Nicotine gum is a great way for improving cognitive performance because of the effects it has on dopamine. But once again, receptors will downregulate, etc. And then you end up chewing more and you get addicted to this because you want to feel like this, and then you don't feel it. You don't feel it anymore. So then you end up doing too much, and then you feel like garbage because it hurts your stomach. And then next thing you know, you're anxious. And so you have to be weary of that as well. So once again, too, you have to either be, I say a strong-minded individual, but the thing is we can affect neurotransmitters. So for example, if you're someone who's doing psychedelics and you feel that, I need to do psychedelics, otherwise I can't continue. That was my issue. Well, that's because that dopamine's low in the first place. So what I'm going to do to combat that, it's not going to have the same effects as psychedelics, but I'm going to help improve your dopamine to take away that addictive tendency. So I'm going to look at things like mucanaprines, for example, or niacinamide to flush adrenaline so you're not converting a lot of it, things along those nature. I'm going to focus on your dopamine, and I'm going to make sure your dopamine's good. But as mentioned, that serotonin and dopamine work inverse of each other. So if you're pumping up a bunch of serotonin all the time, that dopamine is going to decrease over time. The stuff isn't instantaneous. And that's another issue that we have in this society is everything is instant gratification. We want instant results. We want instant feelings. So we do a psychedelic, we feel amazing, and we don't think about what's going to happen 2 weeks from now. And sometimes it's just because people are not properly educated, right? They go on the internet, and I've always said, you will find anything to push your narrative on the internet. It doesn't matter what it is. You will find studies that say, yes, this is good. Or if you think it's bad, you will find studies that say, yes, this is bad. All you got to do is type in psychedelic side effects. And I'm pretty sure something in there to say you might die. And then you're going to be totally deterred from it. Or it's going to say you're going to lose your family or you're going to get divorced. There's something in there that's going to push a narrative. Or you're going to find it that if I do psychedelics all the time, I'm going to reap extreme benefits, especially when you go on forums, when you go on Reddit, right? You just got random people. You got Susie the homemaker, right? You got Jerry the carpenter, and they tried psychedelics once, and so now they're ranting and raving about it, saying it's the best thing. And this is what I've experienced through Facebook groups. You have extremely extremely unqualified individuals telling people what to do or giving advice or saying this. Everything is N of one. Just because it worked for you, because you have individuals that are just really good, just really good genetics. They might be able to do consistent microdosing or consistent bolus doses. These are individuals that are pretty calm already kind of have a good aspect, the good view on life. They're not suffering from depression. They're not suffering from extreme traumas. So they're going to benefit more from psychedelics. But the individuals that have experienced, these traumas and these immense amount of stress, they're going to have the damaged gut lining. They're going to have the overgrowth of bacteria. They're going to have poor pancreatic function. And so then you need to be very careful when you are using these psychedelics, because I've seen it on Instagram. I've seen it with clients. I've just seen it in practice that these people rant and rave about psychedelics, yet they still have immense amount of underlying health issues. So psychedelics are not the answer to your problems. They can help you address your problems. It's the same thing I say about depression medication. I don't believe anybody needs to be on them, but that depression medication can give them enough oomph, however you want to look at it, to actually commit to a plan, a protocol, whichever you want to look at it as, to get away from that underlying root cause, to address that underlying root cause, and then come off the antidepressants and then never need the antidepressants. But some people are just so depressed that they can't even begin to take care of their guts. And then if you try to do that, you push things way like so much further. So you have to do things in steps. I used to be like a big shotgun approach. Oh, so you have an overgrowth. So we got to open up your detox pathways. We got to kill the bacteria. And then people feel like garbage and they get depressed and feel worse. So we got to take care. Okay, so if you're suffering from depression, yeah, sure, it's probably coming from your guts, but let's look at other modalities of how we can slightly improve that depression so we can go after your guts. Oh, you're suffering from allergies. Let's look at the immune system, things along those nature. Oh, you have high levels of mycotoxins. Okay, well, let's start taking care of the mycotoxins because they're going to be pushing the immune system and creating a lot of poor genetic responses. And then you put psilocybin on top of that, and you're only going to feel worse. And that was something I had done. I was microdosing psilocybin while having high levels of mycotoxins, and it exacerbated. Like, you feel good in the moment, but as soon as those, that psychedelic wears off, you begin to feel worse, or in my own experience anyways, and other people can attest to this as well. So I'm very cautious about who I recommend psychedelics to. Plus, once again, I'll say it again, it's a very taboo subject. So as a coach, you could be like, hey, let's talk about psychedelics, and you could totally deter somebody, right? I might, people might even unfollow me for talking about psychedelics or admitting that I have done psychedelics. But they are wonderful, wonderful tools. They can be wonderful, wonderful tools, but they have to be done under the right context. And that context is proper supervision, knowing what your immune system is doing, what you're actually dealing with in terms of your health complications, things like overgrowth of candida or mycotoxins. Then we want to avoid psilocybin. That's where we'd probably do more LSD. Comes down to quality. Mushrooms are relatively safe. People grow them. It's kind of foolproof. Obviously, there are probably some individuals out there that can, tweak or tamper with these, or however you want to look at it, and create poor mushrooms. But LSD, you have to be very careful. I've always said to people, when it comes to LSD, you never know the dosage and you never know what toilet bowl it was made on. That's an extreme exaggeration, but that's kind of like, you have to be safe when you are acquiring these things. And so once again, too, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a shaman, I'm none of this stuff, but if you're someone who's going to use something like LSD, you put it in vodka and then you dose it with a dropper rather than trying to put like tabs and figure it out and trying to do your dosage and stuff. You put it in a dropper and then that way you can disperse it and do it that way. So then if you take some and you're like, I don't really feel anything, maybe take a little more until you find that threshold. But you have to be careful because once again, you get a tab of LSD and it says it's, 10 mcg or something like that. So you're like, oh, okay, well, I need whatever. So I'm going to cut into this very tiny tab. Well, that tab could have been 20. And the next thing you know, you're having a bad trip or you just don't feel good. So you have to be very cautious with these kind of things. And this is why I always say proper supervision. But it's so, obviously LSD is not, but psilocybin, for example, is so readily available on the internet. Anyone can go on and order it now. And then another thing too, I've always had this discussion, so many companies use so many formulas in throwing hot terms around. So it's a marketing thing. Oh, this contains huperzine A1 and this contains bocapa and this contains ginkgo biloba and all these supplements. So you're like, oh, that's going to be amazing, right? Look at all these brain supports. It contains caffeine. That's going to do this and that. And in reality, all those things combined are just marketing terms to get you sucked in because you think they're so great. And then they can actually lead to problems down the road. They can exacerbate the negative effects that I'm speaking on when it comes to psychedelics. So if you're going to do psychedelics, just go with just the psychedelic. There are, once again, everything's context. There are some things where I recommend certain formulas. I love it when they contain L-theanine. So that will promote more GABA. So if you kind of push yourself over the edge, but it's a more controlled response when we look at things that contain something like L-theanine, even though we're trying to upregulate the cognitive performance. Theanine, though, will have a more healthy, controlled response. That's why anybody who ingests caffeine should always have theanine with it. Not pre-workout if you're doing it for those purposes, but anytime, any other time during the day, it's a wise idea to take theanine with your caffeine. Same thing with psychedelics. Maybe a wise idea to take theanine with your psychedelics because then you're going to get a much smoother response, much safer, not kind of go over the edge. I'm not saying that won't happen, but it increases the chances of you having a better experience when using this. So to finish this off, I'll quickly recap. As we mentioned, we have our neurons and we have our synaptic cleft. And serotonin will go into that synaptic cleft to whether it gets taken up into the postneuron and makes its way down the subway tunnels into the station, or it gets broken down by MAO, or it gets reuptaked into the preneuron. And as to why it would do which, there are many variables I'm not going to get into, but that is what can occur within that synaptic cleft. And psilocybin, LSD, things like ketamine, MDMA, the very simplistic way to put it is you are supplementing serotonin. And that is where you are getting these benefits of psychedelics. But supplementing serotonin does not mean it's going to get rid of your candida overgrowth. It does not mean you're going to get rid of your SIBO. It does not mean it's going to improve your gut lining. Like I mentioned, it won't make these things worse. It might in some individuals, especially mycotoxins, but it's not going to improve them. It's just like I say, a healthy diet. I was having a conversation with someone at the dog park this morning. Candida diets are just to lessen the symptoms. They don't actually kill candida. You have to go in with specific killer protocols to get rid of the candida, but they don't make things worse. Everybody knows to remove sugar and alcohol. That's a candida diet, right? You're just not feeding into these things. So the same thing with something like psilocybin is you are lowering cortisol levels. You are improving dopamine. So you're getting into a better mood, which is improving physiological processes, but it's not killing off the candida. It's not ridding of the mycotoxins. So that's where it's important to understand. But that better mood, those lower levels of cortisol, that improved thyroid can improve methylation. So it can improve detoxification. You can build better hormones. You can flush out better toxins. So you're going to have that physiological improvement there. So this is why they have a big name. This is why the research looks so good. And in no way, shape, or form am I saying psychedelics are bad. I just think there's too many people out there that don't fully understand the mechanisms of it and under which context they should be used. But I do believe everybody should at least experience it at some point in their life if they're suffering with extreme health issues or mental health issues, because then it can give you that perspective, can check your ego and make you go, oh, okay, I actually really need to work on this. Okay, maybe I'm not who I thought I was. Maybe this is what I need to do with my life now. And it can be super, super beneficial, right? Or it can go the other way and you can have a really, really bad trip. We know a lot of people who have bad trips. Now, I think that's due to higher levels of adrenaline within the body. A lot of people say it's because you're a bad person or something like that and you're hiding demons. Doesn't make you a bad person. You could be quote unquote hiding demons, but it's just excessive adrenaline within the body. And so then you're getting that negative response. Or you could be somebody that from a genetic standpoint is higher in serotonin. So that's me. So I actually have to watch serotonin things, because if I take 5-HTP, for example, it's going to actually feel worse. I'm really cranky the next day because that's the symptoms of too much serotonin. So once again, everything is all N of one and under the right context and under the right supervision. So I myself, I have had this conversation with clients. I've had this conversation with many people. I do dabble in psychedelics, whether it's myself or whether it's helping clients. And it has shown tremendous benefits. But there are individuals that I will never have this conversation with because I believe that one, they don't need them. Two, there's that addiction aspect where they might get addicted to that. So they have to be careful. And I sometimes just don't have that conversation. Also too, if I'm working with Sally, who's, 75 years old and she goes to church every Sunday, I don't know if it's the best conversation to have with her. Hey, you should do mushrooms. You should do LSD. It's probably not going to go over very well. So, I educate people and it usually does, but do I think psychedelics are bad? No. Do I think they're great? Yes. Do I think everybody should do them? No. Do I think they're going to solve all your issues? Definitely not. So it's important to understand what they do, how they work, and where they should be used. So if you are somebody who just cannot get out of a slump, if you are just, no matter what you do, no matter what supplement you take, no matter what meditation you do, no matter how much journal writing you do, I believe you are someone who should consider the use of psychedelics, whether it's a bolus dose or whether it's microdosing, because it can completely change your life for the better. And there's nothing taboo about psilocybin. It's a mushroom. It grows natural. So once again, society gave it a bad name though. But you're not going to die doing psilocybin. Like I said, LSD, that's an entirely different conversation. Same with ketamine. Same with MDMA. Same with ecstasy. That's an entirely different conversation because that stuff is made. Well, it's still natural in the beginning, then converted, filled with crap, who knows, dangerous stuff. This is why psilocybin, yes. But if you are somebody who's suffering from like high levels of candida, so high levels of fungus and mycotoxins, then you're not going to want to consider psilocybin. then you want to reach out to the right individual when it comes to maybe using something like LSD. But it can definitely change your life or even save your life. Super, super important to understand that they definitely have a time and a place, even if it's just for, a week. They can really create a change within an individual. So that's my beef with psychedelics. As mentioned, a lot of people think that if I talk negatively, we'll use that term, about something, that I entirely hate it. I try not to demonize anything ever. It's not the substance, it's not the supplement or whichever it may be. It's not the food that's the problem. It's the individual, because something is happening within their physiology that is causing it to negatively react with the introduction of this substance or whichever it may be. So it's understanding that, okay, if I'm negatively reacting to this, there's something else going on and that needs to be addressed. But understand too, you might feel really great doing something, but that does not mean you should get biased to it. What do they say? Nothing good lasts forever, right? Your body adapts to everything you throw at it. It's all about survival. And having too much serotonin in the brain is not a key mechanism for survival. So that's very important to understand. So if you guys have any questions on that, it is a complex, nuanced topic, but I feel that I kind of gave the gist of everything there, to help people feel safe and understand and realize that, okay, like, yeah, I tried microdosing, but I didn't get the best results, or I felt great and then I no longer did. You didn't address that underlying root cause, and that still needs to be addressed. But you can still use psychedelics while addressing that underlying root cause. So if you guys like that, I plan on doing more solo ones. As mentioned, I think I'm going to talk about ADD and ADHD next, within how it affects, how your guts affect it and how the brain and everything, and like kind of what brings an individual to suffer from things like ADD and ADHD, but how we can also really deal with that, really address those symptoms, and even get rid of those ADD side effects. So I also want to say, finishing this episode off, that I looked back and I'm going on this is 28 now, I believe. And your guys' support has been amazing. It's driven me to continue to do this because I do get good feedback. I have people watching the entire podcast. Some, like, the average run length or whichever is 3 hours usually. You just get talking and things fly by. Now, obviously the solo ones are going to be shorter. I want them to be more informative, and it could be a lot of information to take in. But thank you guys for your support. I really appreciate it. And I still enjoy doing this, and I want to continue to do this and provide as much education as possible for you guys. So please hit that like button, subscribe if you already haven't. Check out my Instagram at that.coach.curtis. Check out my Facebook group. I have the Gut Healing Collective. That's relatively new, starting to get a lot more members in, where I, share examples of gut, like GI maps and gut cases, and answer any questions you may have. So don't be afraid to pop in there, drop a comment below. And I can help you to the best of my ability with what Facebook allows me to do. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Take care, everybody.